Welcome back to another video, and today I have my first collaboration. I've got a very special guest. Not only is he a brilliant FPL content creator, but he also had an even better season. He came 437th in the world, and I'm delighted to bring to the channel FPL Fran for the first time. Fran, how are you?
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me on the channel. It's actually a privilege to be your first collaboration. I've enjoyed chatting with you last season as well, so nice to do it live here.
For sure, for sure. And I'm very excited for this video. And you know what? Maybe take some notes because Fran obviously did come 437th. He did fantastically well. And thus, I'm sure we can all learn. And I'm looking forward to learning. So, my first question is you are a manager who I would say is multifaceted. You have a lot of impressive attributes to your game. And that incorporates both your eye test and the analytical side of things. So, kind of talk me through that and talk the viewers through that, how you balance those two things and essentially how you go about your structuring of your squads.
Yeah, I think as someone who came a little bit outside of the fantasy management side of things and was just someone who watched a lot of games, but then played fantasy because they enjoy the Premier League, the first thing that you get drawn to, of course, is players that are very good. Just classically, you get drawn to the goals, the assists from every single match, and you tend to spot, young stars, I would say, within the game. And that's what I would say the eye test is great for, right? You kind of catch trends quite early within the season, some tactical shifts that managers might be implementing, like let's say utilizing someone in a different position, maybe showing a bit of a preference for, employing someone in a different position as well. So like, for example, 2 seasons ago when Trent suddenly moved to center mid, we all reacted quite quickly. That's, for example, the eye test part of the game that I think I got down very quickly. But a huge part of fantasy, unfortunately, is fixture planning and also understanding how to readjust, I suppose, your eye test back into the circumstances of FPL. So that's the rules of the game. You've got bonus points, things like that. You probably have to adjust to clean sheets, trying to think about that as well. Trying to balance that side of the game, and also trying to understand, things like captaincies and creating a well-rounded squad, as you mentioned. And I think what's really helped me with that is having a look into data, trying to be reasonable as well with expectations. One of the things I always tend to say to some people with data is ultimately at the end of the day, some of the most crucial points that you'll earn, unfortunately, are appearance points over the course of the season. That's the guarantee. And I think a lot of people might have a slightly higher expectation in terms of how good some players are. So Harry Kane's a great example in the past where I remember on a single game or on a double game week when Harry had a single, I willingly went for Harry over a Leicester player who had two great fixtures. It probably was Vardy at the time or maybe even Madison, but that was sort of my general consensus that I'm always going to pick a better player, even though the other player has maybe two fixtures. And I found out quite quickly that was wrong. And even a simple look at things like, some of the market data that we have, like you look at betting odds. I mean, the reality is more likely than not, when you also include the additional two appearance points, it's always going to be the case that someone who has two fixtures, for example, is going to outscore a much greater player. And that sort of balance, trying to look at things like XG and XA, have really helped me. And looking into studies as well about data, you tend to find too that things like XG have correlative properties. So XG leads to future XG, and that's quite helpful because I think when I recompute that with my sort of eye test brain, it's sort of like when you see someone have a great opportunity in a game and they take a great shot, but actually they missed it. But I actually now look at things like that in situations like that and think, okay, well, that player is actually getting into consistently good positions. I like that, as opposed to, oh, he completely ruined that shot, and I don't like that so much. So it's taken a while, and I think, as I said, FPL has a very niche edge, which is the sort of double game week, blank game week side of things. But looking into data has definitely sort of balanced my eye test around, how to maximize creating a team for, the scoring rules that we have in place and the budget that we have in place too.
I think that's fantastic. So many nuggets of gold in there that I love. What I particularly love is your repurposing and recomputations, how you take things first from an eye test standpoint, put them through the analytics filters and vice versa. And I think that is such an advantage and such a skill to have. So it's definitely something I'm going to learn from, and I'm not going to forget that. And I'm sure many viewers won't. So that's brilliant. Now, looking at this season, obviously we've got a new set of rules, right? 5 free transfers that you can roll, which is a huge difference, and also changes to the bonus point structure in terms of shots on target and fouls won. And also for defenders, they are penalized far more heavily for now conceding a goal. How do you think the game goes? Where do you think it goes? And what do you think the real changes are going to be that we're going to essentially have to be flexible with?
Yeah, I think with defenders, unfortunately, for me, the side effect of this is that your classic attacking fullbacks from really weak defenses, and I think Ait Nuri is such a good example of that last season, especially when he went sort of out of position. But um, these sorts of players from these teams probably will get hurt the most because their avenues to, let's say, get bonus points are sort of reduced, and they have to really excel in open play to really achieve the demands that you want. And especially since, when we look at last season as good context, we had a huge sort of goal scoring inflation across the board. I think we all saw that, and it just, in my opinion, probably strengthens premium defense, even though as a whole you can see that attackers have been sort of positively benefiting from these bonus changes, and defenders conversely, unfortunately, have suffered a little bit. So I feel like it actually widens a little bit of the gap between the sort of weaker defenses versus the premium. And despite obviously the increases in price for let's say Arsenal players or even City players like Guardiola, I do think that premium defenses are still going to be quite valuable. As far as the 5 free transfers, I'm still not quite sure about what my approach will be about that. I think it actually is one of those cases where it comes down to maybe your risk appetite as a manager. You can probably see it as an opportunity to continue to take these short-term risks, knowing that you can roll free transfers anyways, or you can be a bit more passive. Like, I mean, some people are talking about saving 5 free transfers, by game week 6, and I don't think that's going to happen at all. To be quite honest, I think you've got
Yeah, same.
injuries that will inevitably happen, things like that, and something will crop up, or something will be appetizing for me at least to spend and direct a free transfer in. But I'll definitely try to start the season with a bit of a balanced approach regarding that. What do you think about the 5 free transfer yourself?
I share very much the same perspective in the sense that it's going to be very difficult to acquire 5 free transfers at one point.
Mm.
Not only will you have injuries to deal with, fixture changes in the sense that, for example, Bournemouth one week might look like a pretty decent fixture, right? But what happens when Semenyo and Solanke on fire and it becomes significantly more difficult? Do you have all of those external things to deal with? And what about the internal things where you have an opportunity to take a risk that has huge reward, but now you're planning for 3 weeks down the line where you need 4 free transfers, so you can't take it? And thus, I think you have to remain very open-minded to these type of rules and take it from there. One thing I really do agree with, though, is the difference between the lesser defenders and the premium defenders. You are rewarded so heavily now for having a brilliant defense in the sense that when you get a clean sheet, you can now stack it on top of those attacking returns, where it's far more difficult just to get an attacking return and get bonus points. And they're actually a big source of points, especially for the better players. And that's what helps really widen the gap in compared to, say, another game mode like Fan Team, right? Where you're not rewarded for these elite level of performances. Thus, I think investing in premium defenses, like you said, is definitely a very viable and logical route. And as both our drafts have shown, and yours in this video, that's definitely a route we've taken. So the next question is, we have such a big player pool this time around, right? It's very different to last year, especially, let's say, mid last year. And I think FPL have done a fantastic job with pricing. I think this is going to be the best year for the game in many, many years, simply because of how competitive and how ruthless the game is going to be. What filters do we put on ourselves to essentially navigate going through such a difficult period at the start, whereby you can be punished by getting one decision wrong? What do we really need to look for in a player, and how do we need to approach it from a macro level perspective?
Good question. And to be honest, I think the issue with the big pools is we have so much choice that you just have to be comfortable when you think you've made the right decision with the player, as opposed to you've received the right outcome. So let's say you might start the season with someone like Isak, but you were also considering someone like Havertz. If Havertz does brilliantly at the start of the season, he's got something like Wolves at home in game week 1, whereas Isak has Southampton at home. I think the correct approach is to just ensure that you don't get too upset if things don't go your way, and just to understand that there was a great logic. Either way you go, if you're very confident, for example, Havertz is going to play center forward, you know that he's a much better player than if he was to share minutes between, let's say, playing the 8 and a center forward at times, and Jesus maybe occupying a lot of minutes up top, versus, let's say, Isak, who fortunately he really has no negatives. Wilson seems out. And he feels like a bit of a no-brainer. But once again, if you go for someone like Havertz, you save that 0.5, it can upgrade your team elsewhere. So I can understand why managers would make that sort of decision. So going back to the point, I would say you have to just make sure that you have measured expectations. As long as Isak does exactly what you want, as in takes penalties, plays 90 minutes a game, is fit, has decent fixtures ahead of him. You should stay true to that sort of player. But once again, as we tend to see time and time again in terms of the macro perspective, sometimes things change or attitudes change maybe around a player as well. So if you start to see, minutes dwindling for a player, that's where I would start to think, okay, I've got to jump off of a player. And I had that same experience last season with Kai Havertz, actually, when I decided to pick him after the Community Shield game when he played center forward versus Man City.
Yeah.
I saw maybe for around game weeks in a row, he was actually playing in the 8, and I didn't like it at all. So then I decided to jump off. But it wasn't necessarily because he wasn't getting goals and assists, but rather actually the reasons why I picked him, which was to hopefully play center forward, were no longer there, no longer prevalent. So therefore, I make that sort of decision to move off of a pick.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points there for sure. Obviously, with the big selection pool, one thing you spoke about was the fact that you have to be comfortable with outcomes, and I think that is something that is so important in the sense that you don't really want to get upset, right? It is a game and it is there for fun. Thus, being able to detach yourself from outcomes emotionally is so important, and essentially ignoring all the external noise that we're going to get as content creators, right? If we get it wrong, but just knowing that if the decision-making process was fine and the logic was there, and reevaluating that process constantly to make sure that we haven't stepped over the line, then I think you can't really go too wrong, and whatever will be will be. So the last question before we get into your draft, for me, I am really looking forward to a season like this because it's full of chaos, and those are the type of games I like. Really high upside, low downside, but nonetheless high upside. What are you looking forward to most in this type of season?
Yeah, I think for me it's the variety in terms of structure, right? Already we can see people going Salah only, Haaland only, none of them, Anomium really, and even Haaland and Salah. I just think that with the pricing in place, I don't really have too many criticisms with any of these draft structures. Maybe I'm a little bit down on the combination of Haaland and Salah. I do think it's a little bit too restrictive, but I've already named 3 different draft structures in place where surely that already has a compounding effect on the rest of your team selection. So the fact that some people will be going with a little bit more deep rotation, so rotating 4.5 defenders, some people will force a Haaland draft that has 4.0s and things like that and try to maximize the value of the front 11. I just love the chaos, as you mentioned. That will be interesting.
Yeah, sure. I can imagine it getting really, really interesting on Twitter. Big swings. So, with that in mind, I think that was a wonderful discussion, and we definitely learned a lot from that. But let's go into your team and let's see what you've got for us. Right, now, this is a very interesting team, and it shares one huge similarity with mine in the sense that it currently has no Salah. And if you would like to see the reasonings behind why I don't have Mohamed Salah, you can do so in my last video. We'll start at the back, and we're not going to start with the goalkeeper. We're going to start with the defense. We obviously spoke about the upside of having the premium defenders, right, in Trent and Guardiola. But you've paired them with Pedro Porro, which is not a pick I've seen too often. Run me through that. It's a lot of money to invest there, especially when you could have a constant burn rotation. So explain the thinking there.
Yeah, I think look, the realistic approach to Tottenham's defense is there, frankly, quite horrible. But Porro, I do think, is an exceptional attacking defender. And part of the reason for why I've gone for this draft structure is because I'm angling for a wildcard 6 roughly. And Tottenham's fixtures heading towards wildcard 6 are actually quite good. I also generally am, as I said, quite confident in Porro as an attacking player. Yes, there's players like Munoz in the game. I still think he's probably still a level above. And on that basis, I quite like the opening fixtures there for Trent and, Porro. But the reasoning is very much similar to Trent as well, in that they both have great fixtures. And despite, of course, the bonus changes impacting, attacking fullbacks, I believe FPL team produced a study about how Porro lost a lot of bonus points. I still think there's value there in terms of just the attacking potential. And we saw that close to the end of the last season as well.
All right, well, some very interesting points. And I would like to raise a niche point, actually. If we are to assume, especially with the current bonus structure, that you've gone Trent, Guardiola, and Porro, you must be expecting of some clean sheets at least, right?
Yeah,
and thus
100%.
it would. Yeah. So with midfielders, naturally they get 1 point for a clean sheet, right? And that is something to note because 1 point is still a point. It's half your appearance points practically. So does it ever tempt you to potentially potentially try for maybe the early stage where City have pretty good fixtures for a De Bruyne or a Foden if he comes back, or maybe even a Szoboszlai who I've spoken about, or maybe even a Son as a early season punt.
Yeah, I've actually thought about this, and I guess that position would probably be Saka's position to lose, because if you sort of think about Saka, he probably is the player that would make the most sense to move to, let's say, someone like Foden. And to be honest, just looking at Man City, it's a good point. I mean, Alvarez is at the Olympics. They don't actually have that much depth in the sort of positions that Foden will play. I don't think Foden will be, for example, utilized as a winger of any sort. We might see a little bit more Jack Grealish this season at the start, but Foden's definitely a pick that I would honestly be open to using a transfer on if I felt like I had the luxury of it in Game Week 2. But I'm also comfortable with Saka simply because, to me, he's a Game Week 1 captaincy, and I think that's quite important in this sort of draft, where I don't love the Haaland fixture in Game Week 1, and I kind of am looking towards Saka as a captaincy option. Son is clearly another great option too, and so is Isak, to be fair, but unfortunately he's not in this draft. And so Saka is sort of filling that position for me right now.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to challenge you a little bit just to try and justify the claim. You said Saka is, for you now, your number one captaincy option in this draft ahead of Haaland, right?
Just in Game Week
With
1.
Enzo's Yeah, I know. Yeah. So with Enzo's system, do you not think it is slightly exploitable for Haaland? I mean, they're not going to be able to control Manchester City's width too well. They can get exploited there when the centre backs have to go into those wider channels, and it probably leaves a little bit more space than you'd like for Haaland in those central zones, especially given that City are going to get on the ball quite a lot. Saka's not as prolific, maybe, or as someone like Son in terms of hauling big. That's probably what you want from your captaincy option. So are you not concerned about that at all?
And this is where I have to bring, what I've, I guess, learned from the data side a little bit. I tend to be very pessimistic between home and away. So
Okay.
I think there are studies that generally show teams probably play around 10% better home and away, and that sort of translates to XG, translates to XA. I like the aspect of Saka playing at home a lot. And for me, I think if you were, let's say, asking me just a simple question, does Haaland score or have better odds to score a goal compared to Saka, I'd probably actually agree with you. But as I said, I think with the data approach, I tend to not just pick the player that I think will score the most every week, which is why I tend to not captain Haaland all the time. I'll look at multiple factors, like, for example, Saka playing at home, slight maybe odds of clean sheet as well, and of course the assist odds, which are always there, I suppose, with Saka, which is nice, especially versus a team like Wolves at home, who I think were a pretty poor set piece defense last season as well.
Well, it's a very unique perspective and something I've certainly learned from, and I would definitely take that into the season. So I appreciate that. Moving back, just very quickly, Sanchez, you're pretty confident in Chelsea's defense, given their good fixture run, and I guess his save potential in that. Do you want to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting pick, right? Because I think I would say I'd lean towards him as my Game Week 1 keeper, but I'm not. I don't feel like I'm forced to having to keep him. I think there are plenty of 4.5 picks that are actually quite interesting to start. And I've only landed on Sanchez now. Previously, I've also considered Henderson, just because when I look at the fixtures, as I said, to that sort of wildcard 6 window, I generally think that Crystal Palace will probably get more clean sheets than the rest of the field. But yeah, those are positions where I would say it's either Sanchez or Henderson early doors.
Well, sticking with the Palace trend, we've got Eze in the draft. Now, I wasn't as bullish on him previously as I am now. I think I have probably seen him and his fixtures particularly in a different light. I love him as an asset, but maybe his fixtures I see in a different light, especially with the injury to Thiago today. Is Eze a lock for you? Is there no way he's leaving with him being at 7 million and having so many things going for him, right? Penalties, arguably pretty decent fixtures, zone dominance, ball striking, goal threat, assist threat, etc., etc. Penalties.
I think you've hit on the nail on the head. Like, he is a jack of all trades. The bonus changes favor him even more. It's hard to say. I would actually probably say he's the most impressively valued option in the game. I don't think the fixtures are amazing for Crystal Palace. Like, don't get me wrong, but I think it's also you ultimately want to keep a lot of these players in your draft up until your wild card window. And tentatively, what I would say is we probably want to be moving around some of our premium options more than not, and moving options that are, let's say, at some of the cheaper price ranges within the midfield a little bit less often. And if I do think Eze is somewhat of a game breaker, which I think he's very comparable, to be honest, to Mbumo last season. He's got all the sort of positive attributes that Mbumo had last season going for him, but maybe is even slightly better. Shots on target, for example, metrics are also really high compared to other midfielders. Nothing can really go wrong with owning a pick like Eze. It will come across boring to most players, but I would say if he stays at Palace, which actually seems like a big if right now, because it seems like he might also go to Spurs or even City.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he's going to be in my draft if he stays in Palace.
I think that's very, very fair. I'm looking at the same now. I wasn't initially, but I'm looking at the same. You almost read my mind because I was thinking of my next question. You discussed it. We spoke about Foden a little bit earlier in the sense of shifting premiums. It's certainly a strategy given our structures aren't too dissimilar that I'm thinking about. Where does Saka go next week? Is it a potential De Bruyne? Is it a Son if he catches fire in game week 1, or is it maybe a Palmer with the good run?
Yeah, like I wouldn't shy away from Foden at all. I've also thought about Saka to Son game week 5, but given that I'm also wildcard in game week 6, it's not something that I'm saying that there's a booked in transfer. Like if you told me that I'd have to roll all my free transfers until my game week 6 wildcard, and I thought it was possible, I think this team could last itself there. Yeah.
That's fair. Touched on Palmer there. Nkunku, you comfortable in him covering? I think similar to Eze, you make a very good point in that these two are probably the midfielders that have the best value attached to them. I think the Premier League audience probably don't appreciate quite how good of a player Nkunku is, especially just given his like technical quality within the box and around those zones. Thus, are you comfortable essentially holding him for a while, regardless of results? Or are you going to keep a real close eye on him, not just his performances, but also the output?
I think I'll probably care less about the output as long as he plays the amount of football that I expect. The one issue I suppose with
Yeah.
Chelsea is that they do have quite a bit of depth. Like I was looking yesterday at the preseason game, I watched the Nkunku goal, but sitting on the bench is players like Mojik, Jackson, etc., and they'll all fill in places. And Nkunku was also sort of playing almost like a position right behind Mark Guiu. I'm sure Palmer will take some of those sort of positions away from him as well. But what I like about Nkunku, and clearly what the manager had already said, is that he can play multiple positions. So you tend to think, okay, even though Palmer's probably the most important player in the team, he can fill in a lot of roles, and as long as the manager seemingly rates him, he'll probably stay in my draft up until the wild card.
Yeah, I think you make very good points there again. As a Chelsea fan, one thing I would say is I'm very confident in his expected minutes. Very,
Mm-hmm.
very confident.
Yeah.
I simply think, apart from Palmer, in terms of the attacking options, he's just a cut above, and it's only a very short amount of time until we see that within the Premier League week on week when he just does those small actions where he just does them a little bit better than anyone else. And I think he'll be similar to Eze, a lock in many people's side quite quickly. Moving on, we spoke very briefly about them earlier, and we'll get to the last three players. But there is no Newcastle here. There is no Burn, which is very popular, or at least a Newcastle defender spot. There is no Gordon and Isak at all. Most people have the combos from what I've seen on Twitter, and you've got none. And they've obviously got Southampton at home first up. I imagine that worries you a little bit, and the reasonings behind the omissions.
Well, it certainly worries me, and I don't think I have a good reason for the omissions. I think what I'll probably say is I've probably made a decision to go players like Bruno and Wood over Isak and Gordon for now, and I tend to look at maybe someone like Bruno and Isak quite similarly. I think their minutes are perfect, penalty takers. Clearly, Bruno plays a completely different role to Isak, but in terms of what's good and going for them, I do think that it's both there. Fortunately, let's say Bruno compared to let's say Isak and Gordon, their best fixture is actually still game week 1, and I think you'll notice with the United fixtures and the Newcastle fixtures that they just get slightly worse. So yeah, game week 1 is going to be quite tough for me. Fortunately, it's a good game week for Wood as well. But I'm pretty confident in his minutes. If I was a little bit less confident in his minutes, I do think I'd be pretty open to swapping the draft around, maybe to gear around going for Isak, maybe even considering Muniz as well. But his fixtures also don't rotate well with Andreas because clearly they just play in the same team. So I'd probably need to think about solutions to that. One thing I thought about previously was Andreas and João Pedro, for example, rotate quite well. If let's say I was uncertain about Wood's minutes, but I'm not at this moment in time. And tentatively, I also like picking differentials. If I think that, let's say, if I said, this pair versus this pair was going to probably deliver a similar amount of points, if you gave me the least owned option, I'd probably take that every time. And that's just a general sort of playstyle preference I have in FPL.
No, it makes sense. And you justified Wood there nicely because obviously you attributed a good expected minutes to him. So that's what question I was going to ask. Manchester United, Bruno Fernandes, a very unsuccessful season for his owners in FPL last year. Ten Hag has new recruits, Euro, for example, big deal. Explain to me what you think the change in the system is going to be, and just as change in style. I think stylistically, they'll play very similarly, but I do think, given that they have better players with more athleticism and physicality attributed to them, that he could potentially find himself higher up the pitch with a higher volume of actions. And I just wanted to see your perspective on Bruno because I do think he'll be improved.
No, I agree with you completely. I mean, we saw at points last season where he was literally playing like a quarterback because of how awful the team was in being able to progress and even advance the ball, win duels in certain actions of the pitch, which would allow Bruno to stay a little bit higher than you. I mean, stay high like you'd want him to. And I do think, at least it seems like they're active in the market. It doesn't seem like they're that close to getting their sort of second and third transfer in place, even though there was news over the last 2 weeks, which is a little bit of a dampener. But they've already got Xerxes and Euro, which is nice. What I like about Bruno, generally speaking, is he is probably the anti-eye test player, at least this version of Bruno, compared to when he sort of jumped onto the scene with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. So he is very much someone who is going to get a lot of his points potentially through or outside of open play. So penalties, corner kicks, free kicks, things like that. And I have to hope, of course, that is another element of the game that I can hopefully profit from with Bruno. I don't have great expectations for United. I'm not necessarily, already plugging them in my top 4, for example. But yeah, I think Bruno is someone who's a little bit impervious to doing too poorly in FPL. Although I do recognize 2 seasons going, he's had pretty big underperformance, and mostly because his teammates can't finish his chances, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Makes sense. And we have 2 points to go. One, first time I've seen Andreas Pereira in the draft. I've seen the fixtures with Muniz. Obviously, they play for the same team.
Yeah.
And I see the appeal to Muniz. Are you as confident with Andreas Pereira? Because obviously, one thing we've seen with Muniz is he won Premier League Player of the Month, right? And that is no joke. In a league this competitive, especially with the state it's currently in, just getting better and better. He performed exceptionally in that too, to such a high ceiling as an FPL asset. Do you really think Pereira could match that, or essentially even go close?
Yeah, I think, well, within this draft, it's a bit of like almost a Pereira Armstrong rotation. It's not perfect, clearly, because Andreas, for example, has his better game week 2 as well. But with Andreas, I think what's nice is, once again, he's one of those players who, very much like Morgan Gibbs, I would actually call him, almost like a B-Tech Morgan Gibbs White, because he plays less minutes per game. Effectively, he's a 70 to 75 minute player. He has all the actions outside of open play that you want, and will still somewhat be involved within Fulham's attack within open play, but to a very minimal degree. So to me, he's a cheap pick that I just see as an enabler. I'm not expecting him to set the world alight. I think if anyone was to do so, I agree, it would be Muniz once again. But what's nice is with Willian leaving the club, that potentially means more set pieces given or given back to Andreas. Although I recognize Wilson can obviously take quite a few. But more importantly, I would say penalties would probably be restored back to Andreas, which once again, I do have a little bit of a preference for penalty takers, and hopefully he would be the dominant one come start of the season.
Yeah, sure. I think his natural ability from dead ball situations is so good that I can't imagine him getting off it. Now, the last point before we leave you is there is no Salah, similar to my draft at the moment. And earlier in the week, I touched on the fact that a few reasons for his omission were, one, the new system on the slot. It's not quite Jurgen Klopp-like in the sense that the wingers don't get as much half space penetration. They don't make as many runs beyond the last line. They don't function inside enough. And they were very system orientated reasons, alongside the fact that I don't think you can expect, with the same squad and the lack of recruitment, the same level of from Slot as Klopp, because Klopp, as we have seen, is an extremely special manager, right? All you have to do is look at Dortmund, and they haven't won the league since, right? So you can really appreciate now at least how good of a job he's done. And I was wondering, what reasons did you have for Salah being omitted from your squad and getting him back? Because I know that everyone's gonna have their different reasons for not going for such a big premium.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it to me it comes down to two reasons. One quite similar to what you've intonated at, which is the change in manager, and a slight reduction in terms of the overall expectation that I have for Liverpool to perform in. I mean, when we look at some of the data last season, I think they led the league in expected goals, so that clearly suggested that they were the league's best offense. Clearly, they lagged against, let's say, Arsenal and City on defense, which was, a huge difference. But even when I look at, for example, some of the betting markets to start the season, Liverpool's sort of goal expectations are actually a little bit below City, very close to Arsenal. So that generally suggests to me that they're thinking that there's going to be a bit of a drop off with a change in manager. So definitely sort of confirming what you said in terms of change in system, change in pedigree as well. As far as Salah himself, I mean, he is 32. I think he's obviously a one of a kind athlete and one of the greatest
Yeah.
players I've gotten to see, even in real life. And but father time comes to everyone, and if I probably had to pick a captaincy who's going to be dominant every week, I'd probably pick Erling right now, who's in the prime of his
Same.
life and will probably play more minutes. I think that's once again something that I come back to a lot. Yes, of course, Salah is an absolute monster, athletically speaking, but yeah, at 32, you'd imagine that he'd probably still play less minutes than Haaland early doors, and I'm still gearing for that sort of general wildcard 6 window.
Yeah, I think Haaland's had a nice recovery period essentially for his body. We know that injuries trouble him a little bit, but
That's true, yeah.
given the fact that he had the Euros off, he's had a really nice thing. And the last thing, considering you touched on it, wildcard 6, do you want to run us through that very briefly? I imagine that probably deserves its own video, but still.
Yeah, I think it's not the natural window, right? It's not really on an international break, but generally, I suppose there's a bit more of a fixture swing towards Arsenal, amongst other things. Probably have to reassess, how I feel about players like Watkins, etc. And it gives me a bit of time, I would say, early doors to have a look at some of the teams in the season, reassess my expectations, and probably change my draft accordingly. I think what's nice is I could see this draft going towards wildcard 6 without necessarily having to use too many transfers. But I've also sort of kept my mind open to wildcard 8, which is an international break, or if I really have to, wildcard 4, but I'm not very keen on that. And I think that would probably happen if I really demanded a structural shift. But I feel like when that happens, it's very much us sort of reacting to results. And given the fixtures that we have, on our plate, it would probably be if I really felt like I missed the boat out on Salah and suddenly wanted to do maybe two types of transfers. So let's say Haaland out to Watkins plus another transfer into, maybe Salah, for example. But I can't see myself really needing a wildcard for that per se. So I tend to think wildcard 6 is a nice, healthy window to make sure I can also maximize on some price rises and falls. Because I do think part of the thing too is a lot of the people in the community work in a bit of a circular nature. So you see someone going for a wild card, a window gets promoted on the timeline.
Yeah,
You then think
huge.
about it in your head, you go back, you look at your draft and you think, oh, wildcard 6 does make sense. And that's sort of how last season's wildcard 8 kind of happened. I think Praz also did a great video on wildcard 6 in terms of his wildcard windows. I generally agree with most of the thoughts and the fixture swing sort of piece to it. There's also the wildcard 7 aspect where you look a little bit more focused towards City. Very, very niche, but as I said, generally flexible towards that general window. It doesn't have to be 6 per se, but it's what I've loosely planned for this team so far. And also Porro, as you can see, needs to get out of my team probably, and wildcard 6 would be a convenient window to do so.
Yeah, for sure. And not only that, but something we touched on earlier was the strategic elements. Obviously, this game is completely different now to last year. It is such a open fielded game with a huge landscape now, as opposed to last year. There was wildcard 8 and it was very closed almost in terms of the thinking, but also just like your capacity to kind of manipulate that to do better than the field. But now, at least with the fact that we can roll free transfers after a wild card, it allows you to come up with some really interesting strategies and go for a bit of a shorter term approach, just whereby you really back yourself in a short period of time, bank those transfers wild card, and then take them on from there, just in case you need to readjust. So yeah, looks good. It looks good, and I think that is probably all we need to cover for this draft.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for having me on. Really appreciate being the first guest, and looking forward to more content from you.
No worries. It's an absolute pleasure having you on, and I really enjoyed some of the discussions. They were quite in-depth and analytical, so I really like it. And hopefully we'll have you on sometime soon. So with that being said, that comes to the end of the video. Thank you very, very much for watching, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed that with Fran. I thought he made so many in-depth, analytical, insightful points, and I'm definitely going to rewatch this myself. So please do consider subscribing, and of course, subscribe to Fran. He's approaching 40,000 subscribers, and he produces magnificent content. His rank alone deserves that, so make sure to go and subscribe. And as mentioned, you've got a lot of preseason content coming your way. So again, do subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed. We would love to hear what you thought about the draft, about our points, and we'll definitely have more content coming together. See you later.